Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 2400 BCE, to a dusty tomb outside Memphis, Egypt, where two men were buried together in a way that Egypt reserved only for husbands and wives. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In a necropolis west of the pyramids, in a tomb carved into limestone cliffs, two men named Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep were laid to rest in each other's arms. The tomb walls show them nose to nose, embracing, holding hands. Their names mean joined to life and joined to the god Khnum. But the ancient artists did something extraordinary. They painted their names as a single intertwined hieroglyph, one name flowing into the other, inseparable even in writing. No other tomb in all of Egypt does this. Not for brothers, not for friends, only for them. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Egypt. For most of history, these men were alone. They built monuments no one would notice. They loved in a kingdom that would crumble into sand. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why two royal servants were buried like pharaohs, what the tomb artists hid in the hieroglyphs, and how modern Egyptology spent a century pretending these men were just very good friends. Congratulations. You have just woken up in the 5th dynasty of Egypt's Old Kingdom, roughly 2400 BCE. You are approximately 4,400 years before TikTok. Let us see if you can survive. Good luck. The first thing you need to understand about Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep is that they were not noblemen. They were not priests. They were not warriors or scribes or architects. They were hairdressers. Specifically, they were royal manicurists and hairdressers to the king. In Egyptian, their title was Overseer of the Manicurists of the Great House, which sounds almost trivial until you realize that in ancient Egypt, touching the pharaoh's body was one of the most sacred acts a human being could perform. The king was a living god. His hair held divine power. His nails, when trimmed, had to be collected and ritually disposed of, so no enemy could use them in magic. The men who groomed the pharaoh were not servants in the way we think of servants. They were intimate attendants to divinity itself. And two of those men were Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep. We do not know which of them was older. The tomb does not tell us. But we know they worked together, lived together. And at some point someone, maybe the king himself, maybe the royal treasurer, granted them something almost unheard of for men of their class. A joint tomb. Not two tombs side by side. One tomb, shared. With both their names on the entrance. With both their families depicted inside. With their images painted and carved so close together that in some scenes, their noses touch. In one relief, they embrace with their arms around each other's backs. In another, they hold hands. And in the most famous image, the one that stops Egyptologists in their tracks, they stand face to face in the intimate pose called the nose kiss, a gesture Egyptian art reserved for husbands and wives. Let that settle in for a moment. In 2400 BCE, in a civilization we often imagine as rigid and conservative, two men were honored with a tomb that depicted them exactly the way Egypt depicted married couples. The same poses, the same intimacy, the same visual language of devotion. Their tomb was discovered in 1964 by Egyptian archaeologist Ahmed Musa during excavations at Saqqara, the vast necropolis that stretches along the west bank of the Nile just south of Cairo. Saqqara is where Egypt buried its elite for 3,000 years. The step pyramid of Djoser rises there. Hundreds of tombs honeycomb the cliffs, and tucked among them, in a modest but beautifully decorated chamber, Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep waited. When Musa opened the tomb, he found something extraordinary. The walls were covered in painted reliefs showing daily life, offerings to the gods, scenes of the two men supervising workers, hunting in the marshes, receiving gifts. Standard tomb stuff. But the intimacy was not standard. In scene after scene, the two men appear together, not separately, not with other people between them. Together, their bodies overlap, their hands touch. In one image, Khnumhotep places his hand on Nianchkhnum's shoulder, while Nianchkhnum's hand rests on Khnumhotep's waist. Egyptologists have spent 60 years trying to explain this away. The first theory was that they were twins, brothers, identical twins, born together, so close in life that they wanted to be close in death. That would explain the matching names. Both names reference joining and life, and the god Khnum, who was believed to mold humans on a potter's wheel in the womb. Twins would have been seen as a divine miracle. Khnum must have made them at the same time. Neat theory. Except nowhere in the tomb does it say they were twins. Nowhere does it use the Egyptian word for brother, son. In fact, the tomb goes out of its way to show their separate families. Each man had a wife. Each man had children. Those families are depicted on opposite walls of the tomb, Nianchkhnum's family on one side, Khnumhotep's on the other. If they were brothers, their parents would appear in the tomb. Every other Egyptian tomb shows the deceased with their parents, if the parents held any status at all. Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb does not show a single parent, not one. The second theory was that they were just colleagues, close friends, partners in business. Maybe they bought the tomb together to save money, like roommates splitting rent. This theory collapses the moment you look at the nose kiss image. In Egyptian art, the nose kiss is an explicitly romantic gesture. Husbands and wives do it. Gods and goddesses do it. Pharaohs do it with their queens. It appears over and over in love poetry, in tomb paintings, in temple reliefs. It means, unmistakably, intimate affection. No other pair of colleagues in 4,000 years of Egyptian art are shown nose to nose like this. Not once. The third theory, popular in the 1960s and 70s, was that the tomb artists made a mistake. Maybe they copied the design from a husband and wife tomb and forgot to change the figures to look less intimate. Except these artists were not apprentices. They were master craftsmen working for royal servants who had access to the king. Every line was intentional, every colour chosen, every hieroglyph placed with precision, and they chose to show two men in love. By the 1990s, a few Egyptologists began to whisper the obvious conclusion. In 1994, Dr. Greg Reeder, an Egyptologist who specialises in gender and sexuality in ancient Egypt, published a careful analysis of the tomb. He laid out the visual evidence piece by piece: the nose kiss, the embraces, the hand-holding, the intertwined names, the joint burial. His conclusion was simple. Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep were a same-sex couple, not brothers, not friends. A couple. Reeder was not the first to notice, but he was the first to say it in print without hedging. And the Egyptological establishment did what academic establishments do when confronted with inconvenient queerness. They ignored him. For 20 years, mainstream Egyptology continued to call Nianchkhnum and Khnumhotep brothers or twins in museum labels and textbooks, even as the evidence piled up against it, even as more scholars joined Reeder in pointing out the obvious. It was not until the 2010s, when a new generation of Egyptologists trained in queer theory and gender studies entered the field, that the tide began to shift. Today, most specialists who study the tomb agree these men were almost certainly lovers, partners, a couple, and their relationship was not hidden. It was celebrated, carved into stone, painted in bright colours, placed in a tomb meant to last forever. Which brings us to the question that keeps me awake at night. Why? Why were two men allowed to be buried this way in ancient Egypt? The answer is not that Egypt was some progressive paradise. It was not. Egyptian society had strict gender roles, rigid hierarchies, laws that controlled everything from marriage to property to religious ritual. But sexuality in ancient Egypt did not work the way we think it did. There was no concept of gay or straight in the modern sense. No identity built around whom you desired. Sexuality was about role, not orientation. It was about who penetrated and who was penetrated. It was about maintaining social order and family lineage. For men, the expectation was simple. Marry a woman, father children, continue the family line. That was your duty. But what you did beyond that, whom you loved, whom you held in private. Egypt did not have a word for that, and in many cases, it did not seem to care. We know Egyptian men had intimate relationships with other men. The evidence is scattered but unmistakable. Love poetry between men. Tomb paintings showing men in suspiciously close embraces. Magical spells designed to attract a man's love. Religious myths where gods take male lovers. The most famous example is the myth of Horus and Set. In one version of the story, Set tries to assert dominance over Horus by sexually penetrating him. Horus tricks Set into ingesting his semen instead, which establishes Horus as the dominant god. The story is wild and strange and clearly about power, but it also takes for granted that gods, who were models for human behavior, engaged in same-sex acts. The key was this: as long as you fulfilled your social role, as long as you married and had children and maintained your family's honor, what you did in private was between you and the gods. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep both married. Both had children. Both upheld their social duty. And then they built a tomb that said, "This is the person I loved most. This is the person I want to spend eternity with." Not their wives, each other. Their wives appear in the tomb, yes, depicted small, on the side walls, with their children. Honored, but secondary. The central images, the ones you see first when you walk in, the ones carved largest and painted brightest, are Niankhnum and Khnumhotep. Together, always together. In Egyptian belief, the tomb was your house for eternity. The images on the walls were not just decoration. They were magical. What you depicted would be yours forever in the afterlife. Food offerings painted on the wall would feed your spirit. Servants carved in stone would serve you. Family members shown beside you would be with you. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep chose to spend eternity together. That was not an accident. It was a declaration. Now let us talk about what happened to their tomb after they died, because here is where the story gets heartbreaking. Sometime after the tomb was sealed, we do not know exactly when, but likely within a generation, someone went into the tomb and tried to erase them, not rob them. Tomb robbers take jewelry, gold, anything valuable. They do not care about the dead. They want treasure. This was different. Someone chiseled out their names. Not all of them. Just the intertwined hieroglyphs. The ones where Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's names were written as a single word, inseparable. Someone took a chisel and carefully, methodically, destroyed those specific carvings. In some places, they chiseled out Khnumhotep's face. In others, they scraped away the image of the two men embracing, leaving only Niankhnum's figure intact. It was an act of damnatio memoriae, the deliberate erasure of someone from history. In Egypt, this was the worst fate imaginable. Your name was your soul. If your name was destroyed, your spirit died. You ceased to exist in the afterlife. Someone wanted Khnumhotep erased. Why? We do not know. The tomb does not tell us. But here is what we can guess. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep likely died around the same time. They were buried together, so at least one of them outlived the other, arranged the burial, and then joined him. After they were gone, control of the tomb would have passed to their families. And their families, specifically their children, may not have liked what the tomb said about their fathers. Egyptian inheritance was matrilineal in many cases. Your status came from your mother's family as much as your father's. If Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's children wanted to claim full legitimacy, they may have wanted to distance themselves from the suggestion that their fathers were anything other than proper husbands. Or maybe it was religious. Maybe a new priest, a new dynasty, a new political shift made their relationship suddenly unacceptable. Or maybe it was personal. Maybe one of their sons was ashamed. We will never know. But here is what I know. Whoever tried to erase them failed, because 4,400 years later, we know their names. We see their faces. We stand in their tomb and we see them holding hands. The chisel marks are still visible. You can see where the stone was scarred. But enough survived. Enough survived for us to know they loved each other. When archaeologist Ahmed Musa first published the tomb in 1977, he described Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep as twins. That was the safe interpretation, the one that would not raise eyebrows. But even Musa could not ignore what he was seeing. In his notes, he admitted the tomb was unusual. The intimacy was remarkable. The intertwined names were without parallel. He knew. He just could not say it. In 2005, Dr. Greg Reeder returned to Saqqara with a team of researchers to re-examine the tomb. They photographed every inch of the walls. They catalogued every defacement. They compared the tomb to hundreds of other 5th dynasty tombs. Their findings were published in a landmark paper in 2008. The title was careful, academic, hedged with qualifiers, but the conclusion was clear. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep were a same-sex couple. The first in recorded history. Not the first to exist. Obviously not. Same-sex love is as old as humanity, but the first whose love was recorded, carved in stone, made permanent. The first whose tomb lets us see them, know them, say their names. And here is the most extraordinary part. They were not kings. They were not gods. They were not mythical heroes. They were hairdressers. They trimmed the king's nails. They oiled his hair. They stood close enough to the pharaoh to touch him, yes. But they were not royalty themselves. They were working men. And they were honored with a tomb that said, "Love matters. This love matters." In the Old Kingdom, only the elite were buried in decorated tombs. Most people, farmers, laborers, even minor officials, were buried in simple graves, maybe with a pot or two, maybe with nothing. You did not get a painted tomb unless you had status, wealth, or a very generous patron. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep's tomb is not as grand as a noble's. It is not as massive as a high priest's, but it is beautiful. The art is skilled. The colors are vibrant. Someone spent months carving those walls. Someone paid for it. Most likely the king, or someone in the royal household who loved them. Because here is what we know about royal servants in Egypt. They were valued. The men and women who touched the king's body, who dressed him, bathed him, groomed him, they were trusted with the most intimate access to divinity. They saw the king weak, tired, sick. They saw him human. That intimacy created bonds. We see it over and over in Egyptian records. Royal servants were given gifts, land, titles. When they died, the king sometimes paid for their burials. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep served the king well, and someone made sure they were remembered, not as servants, as lovers. The tomb sits today in Saqqara, open to visitors. You can walk inside, you can see the paintings, you can stand in the same chamber where their bodies once rested. The sarcophagi are gone, stolen or destroyed centuries ago, but the walls remain. And on those walls, Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep still hold hands, still embrace, still stand nose to nose, frozen in a kiss that has lasted 4,000 years. I have seen photographs of tourists standing in that tomb, staring at the images, visibly moved. Some cry, some smile, some just stand there, quiet, taking it in. Because this is not abstract history. This is not a clay tablet or a legal record or a piece of pottery. This is two men who loved each other and who made sure the world would know. They could have hidden it. They could have been buried separately with their wives in proper conventional tombs that no one would question. They chose this instead. They chose to be remembered together, and that choice echoes. It echoes in every museum label that finally, after decades, identifies them honestly. It echoes in every LGBTQ plus Egyptian who visits Saqqara and sees themselves in ancient stone. It echoes in every scholar who now studies Egyptian sexuality without flinching, without hedging, without pretending queerness did not exist. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep were not the only same-sex couple in ancient Egypt. They were just the ones who left the clearest evidence. There were others. We catch glimpses. A pair of women buried together in the Middle Kingdom. Tomb paintings showing men in poses a bit too intimate to be just friends. Love spells addressed to male lovers. Magical texts that assume same-sex desire as a natural part of the world. But none as clear as this. None that say, unmistakably, we were here, we loved, and we mattered. Now let us talk about what their daily life might have looked like. Because to understand why their tomb matters, you need to understand what it meant to be a royal manicurist in the 5th dynasty. The great house, the palace, at Memphis was not a single building. It was a sprawling complex of courtyards, audience halls, private chambers, temples, workshops, kitchens, guard barracks, and servant quarters. Thousands of people lived and worked there. Priests who performed daily rituals for the king's divine essence. Scribes who recorded grain deliveries and tax receipts. Cooks who prepared elaborate meals. Guards who stood at doorways with copper-tipped spears. And somewhere in that complex, in chambers close to the king's private rooms, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep had their workspace. We know from other tombs what a royal grooming chamber looked like. A low platform where the king would sit or recline. Small tables holding bronze razors, tweezers, pumice stones, bowls of scented oils. Linen cloths soaking in water perfumed with myrrh. Jars of coal for lining the eyes. Pots of malachite powder for green eye paint. The work was delicate, intimate, quiet. Picture this. Early morning. The sun has just cleared the eastern horizon and the palace is coming awake. Servants move through corridors carrying bread still warm from the ovens, jars of beer, fresh linens. Somewhere a priest is chanting the dawn hymn to Ra. The smell of incense drifts from the temple. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep enter the grooming chamber. Maybe they have been up for an hour already, preparing, heating water, mixing oils, sharpening the bronze razors on a whetstone. The king arrives. He is tired. He was up late hearing petitions, settling disputes, performing rituals. Being a living god is exhausting. He sits. Khnumhotep, let us say it is Khnumhotep this morning, steps forward with a warm cloth. He wipes the king's face gently. The king closes his eyes. This is the one moment in his day when he does not have to perform divinity, when he can just be a man with someone else's hands on his skin. Nyankhnum trims the king's nails. Each clipping is caught on a linen cloth and will later be burned in a sacred fire. Nothing of the king's body can fall into the wrong hands. They do not speak much. The work requires concentration, but occasionally the king will say something, ask a question, make a comment about the weather, the Nile's flood level, a dream he had, and Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep will answer, quietly, respectfully, but honestly, because they are not strangers to him. They see him like this every day, every morning, year after year. They know his moods. They know when he is worried. They know when he slept badly. They can tell from the tightness in his shoulders whether the day will be difficult. This is intimacy, not sexual, not romantic, but real. And somewhere in the rhythm of those mornings, those years of shared quiet work, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep became something to each other. Maybe it started as friendship. Maybe they were assigned to work together when they were young, apprentices learning the craft. Maybe they stood side by side for years before they realized what they felt. Or maybe it was immediate. Maybe the first time they saw each other, something shifted. We will never know that part, but we know it deepened. We know it became the central relationship of their lives. Because when it came time to plan for eternity, they did not choose their wives. They chose each other. Egyptian marriage was practical, a legal arrangement, a way to secure property, produce heirs, link families. Love was nice if it happened, but it was not required. You married because society expected it, because children were wealth, because a man without a family was incomplete. Nyankhnum married. Khnumhotep married. They had children. They fulfilled that obligation. But their tomb makes clear where their hearts were. In Egyptian tomb art, size matters. The most important people are depicted largest. The tomb owner is always the biggest figure. His wife is usually slightly smaller, children smaller still, servants tiny. In Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb, the two men are the same size. Exactly the same, equal. Their wives are depicted much smaller, tucked into side registers, present but secondary. The message is unmistakable. This relationship, this bond between us, is the most important thing in our lives. Now contrast that with a typical Egyptian couple's tomb from the same period. In the tomb of Ptahhotep, a high-ranking official buried near Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, the owner is shown large and central. His wife appears beside him in some scenes, smaller, her hand resting gently on his arm. The visual language says, "We are married, we are a unit, but I am the head of this household." In the tomb of T, another 5th dynasty noble, T dominates every scene. His wife is present, but always slightly behind him, slightly smaller, clearly subordinate. This was normal, expected. The husband led, the wife followed. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb breaks that pattern completely. They are equal, side by side. Neither leads, neither follows. In one scene, they are shown supervising workers in the marshes. Fowlers are catching birds in nets. The two men stand together, watching, hands at their sides. But their bodies are angled toward each other. Their feet point toward each other. Even when they are watching workers, they are oriented toward each other. In another scene, they receive offerings. Servants bring them bread, beer, meat, linen. The two men sit side by side on a bench, their knees almost touching. Behind them, small figures of their children stand in neat rows, and in the most intimate scene, the one art historians keep coming back to, they stand face to face in the nose kiss position. Nyankhnum's hand is on Khnumhotep's shoulder. Khnumhotep's hand rests on Nyankhnum's back. Their noses touch, their eyes are level. The Egyptian word for this pose is sen-en. It appears in love poetry. It appears in royal marriage scenes. It means a kiss of greeting, affection, intimacy. Husbands and wives do this in tomb art to signal their bond. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep are doing it too. And the artist who carved it knew exactly what he was depicting. Because Egyptian artists were not naive. They were trained for years. They learned a strict visual grammar. Every gesture had meaning. Every posture conveyed status. A hand placed here meant respect. A hand placed there meant intimacy. The nose kiss was not ambiguous. It meant love. Dr. Zahi Hawass, former Egyptian Minister of Antiquities, visited the tomb in 2010 with a film crew. He stood in front of the nose kiss relief for a long time. The camera kept rolling. Finally he said, very carefully, "This is a unique scene. We do not see this between two men anywhere else in Egyptian art." The interviewer pressed him. "What does it mean?" Hawass hesitated. Then he said, "It means they were very close." The interviewer pushed further. "But the pose is the same as married couples." Hawass smiled. A careful, diplomatic smile. "Yes, it is the same." He did not say the word, but he did not deny it either. That interview circulated widely in Egyptian LGBTQ+ communities, because here was one of the most powerful archaeologists in Egypt, standing in the tomb, acknowledging what was right in front of him. Not with enthusiasm, not with pride, but not with denial either. Just, yes, this is what it looks like. For queer Egyptians, that was significant. Egypt today has no legal recognition of same-sex relationships. Homosexuality is not technically illegal, but debauchery laws are used to prosecute LGBTQ+ people. Pride flags are banned. Queer activists face harassment, arrest, imprisonment. To have an ancient tomb that says, "This has always been part of Egypt. This is not foreign. This is not imported. This is 4,000 years old and carved into our bedrock," that matters. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep are not just history. They are evidence. Proof that queerness is not a Western invention, not a modern corruption, not something alien to Egyptian culture. It was here, at the very foundation. When the tomb was first discovered in 1964, Egypt was a different country. Gamal Abdel Nasser was president. Arab nationalism was at its height. The focus was on reclaiming Egyptian identity from colonial narratives, on proving the greatness of ancient Egypt, on using archaeology as a source of national pride. A tomb showing two men in love did not fit that narrative, so it was quietly labelled twins in the initial reports. The intimacy was noted, but not explained. The tomb was published in archaeological journals, but it did not make headlines. It was not until the 1990s, when Western Egyptologists began applying queer theory to ancient art, that the tomb's true significance started to emerge. Greg Reeder's 2000 paper was the turning point. He wrote, "The tomb of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep presents us with the earliest known artistic representation of a same-sex couple in human history. The evidence is visual, textual, and contextual. To ignore it is to erase a fundamental part of ancient Egyptian lived experience." That paper made waves. Some Egyptologists embraced it. Others dismissed it as reading too much into the evidence. Others still argued that we can never truly know what people in the past felt, so any conclusion is speculation. But Reeder had an answer to that. He pointed out that we accept heterosexual relationships in tomb art without hesitation. When we see a man and woman in the nose kiss pose, we do not say, "Well, we can't really know if they loved each other." We assume the art means what it appears to mean. Why should same-sex intimacy be held to a different standard? Why do we need overwhelming proof before we are allowed to say, "These men loved each other"? That question hung in the air. And slowly, over the next 2 decades, the field began to shift. By 2015, major museums were updating their labels. The British Museum's online database describes the tomb as depicting two men in a relationship that may have been romantic. The Petrie Museum at University College London goes further. Likely a same-sex couple, not definitive, still hedged, but moving in the right direction. In 2019, an Egyptian LGBTQ+ activist named Malak visited Saqqara specifically to see the tomb. He later wrote about the experience on a now-deleted blog. "I saved a copy before it disappeared." He wrote, "I stood in that tomb and I cried. I did not expect to cry. But seeing two men, Egyptian men, from my own country's history, depicted with so much love, it broke something open in me. I have spent my whole life being told that people like me do not exist in Egypt, that we are a foreign disease, that we betray our heritage just by existing. And here were two men, 4,000 years old, holding hands on a wall. They were here first, long before anyone told me I did not belong." That blog post circulated quietly among Egyptian queer communities. It was translated into English, Arabic, French. It was screenshot and shared and saved. Because Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep matter beyond academia, beyond archaeology, beyond tourism. They matter because they existed, and their existence was honoured. Let us talk about the hieroglyphs for a moment, because this is where the tomb gets truly extraordinary. In Egyptian writing, names were sacred. Your name was your identity. It was your soul. To speak someone's name aloud was to keep them alive in the afterlife. To erase someone's name was to kill them spiritually. Names were written inside cartouches, oval frames that protected and elevated them. But cartouches were reserved for royalty. Non-royal people had their names written in standard hieroglyphs, often with a small seated figure at the end to indicate gender. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's names are written dozens of times throughout the tomb, on doorways, on wall registers, above their images, but in several key places, their names are written together, interlocked, merged. The hieroglyphs for Nyankhnum are the symbols for life and joined, and the god Khnum's name. The hieroglyphs for Khnumhotep are the god Khnum's name, joined, and content, or at peace. In standard writing, you would write both names separately, one after the other. But in this tomb, the artists wrote them as a single word. They merged the hieroglyphs so that Khnum appears only once, shared between both names. The joined symbol appears once, connecting both. It reads almost like a compound name, a married name, Nyankhnum Khnumhotep, joined to life joined in peace. This is not done anywhere else in Egyptian art. Not for brothers, not for co-workers, not for friends, only here. And it was deliberate. Hieroglyphic writing followed strict rules. You did not accidentally merge two names. An artist had to make a conscious choice to do it. Someone looked at these two men and thought, their names should be written together, as one. After the tomb was sealed, after Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep were laid to rest, someone came back and tried to undo that. The defacement is specific, targeted. In the places where their names are merged, the chisel marks are deepest. Someone tried to separate the hieroglyphs, to break the connection. In the places where Khnumhotep's face appears alone, it has been scraped away. But in the scenes where both men appear together, often both faces survive. It is as if the defacer could not bring himself to destroy both of them. As if erasing the relationship, erasing Khnumhotep as an individual, was enough. Or perhaps he was interrupted. Perhaps he started the work and never finished. We will never know. But the damage tells us something important. Someone, at some point, was threatened by what this tomb represented. Not enough to destroy it completely. Not enough to seal it or burn it or tear it down. But enough to try to separate them, to break the visual bond, to say, you cannot be together, not even in stone. And yet, they are still together. 4,400 years later, we see them. We read their names. We see the love carved into the walls. The defacement failed. Now let us talk about the items that would have been buried with them. Because what you took into the afterlife said everything about who you were. We do not have their burial goods. The tomb was robbed in antiquity, likely in the first intermediate period, when central authority collapsed and tombs across Egypt were plundered for anything valuable. The sarcophagi are gone. The canopic jars that held their organs are gone. The jewellery, the amulets, the furniture, gone. But we can reconstruct what would have been there based on other 5th dynasty burials of similar status. Wooden headrests to support their heads in the afterlife. Linen wrappings for their mummies, layer upon layer, each strip carefully placed. Amulets tucked between the wrappings, scarabs for the heart, djed pillars for stability, ankhs for life. Small shabti figures, servant statues that would magically come to life and do work for them in the field of reeds. Pottery jars filled with food offerings, bread, figs, dates, cuts of meat, mummified so they would last forever. Jars of beer and wine, personal items, perhaps the bronze razors they used in life, perhaps a mirror, perhaps a comb, and, this is speculation, but informed speculation, perhaps something that belonged to the other. In Egyptian couple burials, it was common for husbands and wives to be buried with tokens of each other, a piece of jewellery, a lock of hair, something small that said, "You are with me." If Nyankhnum died first, would Khnumhotep have placed something of his own in the burial? A ring, perhaps, a bracelet. And when Khnumhotep died, would he have been buried holding something that once belonged to Nyankhnum? We will never know. The robbers took everything, but I like to think they were buried holding hands. The positioning of bodies in Egyptian tombs was highly symbolic. Royal couples were sometimes buried in double sarcophagi, side by side, their hands carved in stone to touch across the gap. If Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep had the resources, if their patron was generous, they might have had something similar. 2 wooden coffins placed side by side, 2 mummies wrapped in linen, lying parallel. And when the lid was closed, in the darkness, their hands touching. That is what the tomb art shows. That is what they wanted for eternity. Dr. Salima Ikram, an Egyptologist who specializes in mummification and burial practices, was asked once in an interview whether she thought Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep were buried together in the same sarcophagus. She paused. Then she said, "It would be unprecedented. We have no examples of 2 adult men sharing a sarcophagus, but this tomb is already unprecedented. So, perhaps." That perhaps carries a lot of weight, because Egyptology is a conservative field. You do not make claims without evidence. You hedge, you qualify, you say possibly and may have, and the evidence suggests. For Ikram to say perhaps about a shared sarcophagus is as close as a scholar gets to saying, "I think they were." The tomb sits empty now. The burial chamber is a rectangular room carved into bedrock, maybe 3 meters by 4 meters. The walls are plain. The floor is dusty. Sunlight filters in from the entrance corridor, making the air hazy. When tourists visit, they stay in the outer chambers where the painted reliefs are. The burial chamber is not interesting to most people. No color, no art, just stone. But that is where Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep rested, for centuries, maybe 1,000 years, until robbers broke in and scattered their bones and stole everything. We do not know where their bodies are now, likely destroyed, maybe fragments of bone mixed into the sand outside the tomb. But the tomb itself remains, and that tomb is a declaration. It says, we lived, we loved, we were honored for it. It says, this is not new, this is not modern, this is ancient, this is foundational. It says, you cannot erase us. Now we need to talk about what happened in Egyptian scholarship between 1964 and 2000, because the silence around this tomb is its own kind of violence. When Ahmed Musa published his excavation report in 1977, 13 years after discovering the tomb, he devoted exactly 3 sentences to the intimate scenes. 3 sentences in a 70-page monograph. He wrote, "The 2 men are depicted in poses of unusual closeness. The intertwined names suggest a special bond. Further study is needed." And then he moved on to discussing pottery fragments. Further study was not pursued. Not by Musa, not by his colleagues, not by the Egyptian Antiquities Service. The tomb was catalogued, photographed, measured, restored, and then quietly filed away as the twins' tomb in the Saqqara records. It stayed that way for 23 years. Why? The easy answer is homophobia, and yes, that was part of it. Egypt in the 1970s and 80s was not a place where academic papers about ancient gay couples would be well received. But there is a deeper answer, a more uncomfortable one. Egyptology as a field has always had a fraught relationship with sexuality. Not just queerness, all sexuality. The discipline was founded by Victorian Europeans who were deeply uncomfortable with the fact that ancient Egypt was openly, casually sexual in ways that shocked their sensibilities. Egyptian love poetry was explicitly erotic. Temple walls showed gods with prominent erections. Medical papyri discussed contraception and erectile dysfunction with clinical detail. Mythology included divine incest, adultery, gender transformation, and yes, same-sex encounters. The Victorians dealt with this by ignoring it, mistranslating it, hiding it in footnotes written in Latin so only other scholars could read it. And that pattern continued well into the 20th century. When the Leiden Papyrus was translated in 1931, a Roman-era Egyptian text that included a love spell for attracting a man, the translator rendered the male pronouns as female in the English version. He simply changed he to she throughout. When scholars finally published an accurate translation in 1986, they buried it in an academic journal that almost no one outside the field would ever read. When tomb paintings showed two men in intimate poses, they were described as friends or companions or brothers in museum labels, even when the visual evidence clearly suggested otherwise. This was not unique to Egyptology. Classics did the same thing with Greek homosexuality for decades. Biblical archaeology did it with David and Jonathan. Medieval studies did it with romantic friendships. But Egyptology had a particular problem. Because Egypt was not a Western civilization, it was African, it was Arab, it was other. And European scholars had spent centuries constructing a narrative about ancient Egypt that positioned it as the wise, noble predecessor to Western civilization, conveniently scrubbed of anything too foreign, too sexual, too queer. They wanted Egypt to be palaces and pyramids and pharaohs. They wanted hieroglyphs and gold and mystery. They did not want two men kissing on a tomb wall, because that would complicate the narrative. It would raise questions. It would force them to admit that sexuality in the ancient world did not work the way Victorian England pretended it did. So the tomb of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep sat in the archives labelled twins, and most Egyptologists went about their work without ever questioning it. Until Greg Reeder. Reeder was not a typical Egyptologist. He came to the field later in life, after working as a photographer and activist in San Francisco during the AIDS crisis. He watched friends die. He watched the government ignore them. He watched history erase them in real time. When he started his PhD in Egyptology in the 1990s, he brought that experience with him. He looked at Egyptian tomb art, and he saw what others had trained themselves not to see. He saw queerness. He saw same-sex intimacy. He saw erasure, and he decided to name it. His 2000 paper on Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep was not the first thing he published on sexuality in ancient Egypt. He had been building toward it for years. Papers on gender ambiguity in Egyptian art, papers on the flexibility of Egyptian sexual categories, papers that carefully, methodically laid the groundwork. But the Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep paper was different. It was direct. It did not hedge. The abstract began. This paper presents evidence that the 5th dynasty tomb of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep depicts a same-sex couple. Not may depict, not could be interpreted as, depicts. The paper went through peer review at the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. It was accepted, published, entered the official record. And then the backlash began. Not public backlash. Egyptology is too polite for that. But quiet professional backlash. Reeder's work was cited, but often dismissively. Papers would mention the tomb and then add, though Reeder's interpretation is contested, without actually engaging with his evidence. At conferences, other scholars would smile politely when he presented, and then change the subject during the Q&A. He applied for faculty positions. He was not hired. He applied for research grants. He was not funded. His CV was impeccable. His scholarship was rigorous. But the field froze him out, not because his work was bad, because it was uncomfortable. In a 2005 interview with a queer history podcast, Reeder said, "Egyptology wants to be progressive. It wants to celebrate diversity, but it wants to do it on its own terms. It wants to acknowledge queerness in ancient Egypt in a way that feels safe, that does not threaten the existing narratives. And I was not willing to do that. I was not willing to say maybe when the evidence said yes." Reeder left academia in 2008. He still publishes occasionally independent scholarship, but he never got the tenure-track position he deserved. The field's loss. But here is what happened after he left. A new generation of Egyptologists, trained in queer theory, in post-colonial studies, in critical approaches to archaeology, started entering the field. Scholars like Cecilia Thomas, like Ian Jenkins, like Kara Cooney, who wrote an entire book about the female pharaoh Hatshepsut that openly discussed gender fluidity in Egyptian kingship. These scholars did not have to fight the same battles Reeder did. They had his work to build on. They could cite him. They could say, "This has already been established, now we are going further." By 2015, the tide had shifted enough that major museums started updating their materials. the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York added a note to their online database entry for 5th Dynasty tombs. Recent scholarship suggests that some tomb depictions may represent same-sex relationships. Careful. Hedged. But there. The British Museum went a bit further. Their educational materials now include a section on gender and sexuality in ancient Egypt that explicitly mentions Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep as a possible same-sex couple. And in 2018, the Cairo Museum opened a new exhibit on daily life in the Old Kingdom. Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb was featured prominently. The placard read, in Arabic and English, "Two royal servants, buried together in a tomb that shows them in poses of great intimacy. The nature of their relationship remains debated, but their bond was clearly profound. Not perfect, still hedged. But the fact that it was acknowledged at all, in an Egyptian government museum, in a country where homosexuality is criminalized, that was significant. A step. A small step, but a step. Now let us talk about the other evidence of same-sex relationships in ancient Egypt. Because Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep were not unique, they were just the most visible. In the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 BCE, there is a tomb at Beni Hassan belonging to two women named Kenemetneferhotep and Kentikhetihotep. Their names are almost as much of a mouthful as our two manicurists. The tomb shows them seated side by side, holding hands. Their children are depicted small in the background. The visual language is the same as Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb. Two women, same size, equal status, holding hands. Art historians have called them sisters, or possibly mother and daughter, though the age difference in the depictions does not support that. No one calls them a couple, not officially, but the parallels are striking. In the New Kingdom, during the reign of Akhenaten, there is a relief fragment that shows two men embracing. One man's hand is on the other's shoulder. Their faces are close. The fragment is damaged, so we do not have their names, but the pose is unmistakable. It was found at Amarna, Akhenaten's capital city, in a pile of rubble from a demolished building. Someone destroyed the building. Someone smashed the relief. But the fragment survived. And then there are the love spells. Egyptian magical papyri are full of them. Spells to attract a lover. Spells to keep a lover faithful. Spells to make someone think about you constantly. Most are heterosexual, man seeking woman, woman seeking man. But not all. In the Greek magical papyri, a collection of spells from Roman-era Egypt written in Greek and Demotic, there are at least 6 spells written by men seeking to attract other men. One spell, dated to the 3rd century CE, reads, "I conjure you, Daimon, to bind Name, son of Name, so that he cannot sleep, cannot eat, cannot drink, until he comes to me. Name, son of Name, loving me with his entire heart." The pronouns are male throughout. The spell is explicit about what the caster wants. Another spell instructs the user to write the beloved's name on a piece of lead, pierce it with a bronze needle, and bury it in a graveyard while reciting, "Just as this lead is cold, so may Name be cold to all others and burn only for me." These spells are not poetic metaphors. They are practical magic. Men use them, which means same-sex desire was common enough that professional magicians included it in their repertoire. You do not write spells for things that never happen. And then there is mythology. The most famous example is the conflict between Horus and Set. In one version of the myth, Set tries to humiliate Horus by penetrating him. Horus catches Set's semen in his hand and throws it into the Nile. Then Horus tricks Set into eating Horus's semen, which he has placed on lettuce. When the gods convene to judge who should rule Egypt, Horus's semen speaks from inside Set's body, proving Horus's dominance. The story is wild, bizarre, frankly uncomfortable to modern readers, but it is also revealing, because the story takes for granted that gods engage in same-sex acts. The issue is not the act itself. The issue is dominance. Who penetrates and who is penetrated. That was the Egyptian framework for understanding sexuality. Not straight versus gay. Not heterosexual versus homosexual. Active versus passive. Penetrator versus penetrated. The penetrator retained his masculinity, his status, his power. The penetrated, if he was an adult man, lost status. But two men could be intimate without penetration. They could embrace, kiss, hold each other, love each other. And as long as they married women and had children, as long as they fulfilled their social roles, what they did beyond that was between them and the gods. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep navigated that system. They married, they had children, they did what was expected, and then they built a tomb that said, but this is what mattered most. Now imagine being a young queer Egyptian today, living in Cairo or Alexandria or Luxor. You have grown up hearing that homosexuality is Western, that it is a corruption imported by colonialism, that it has no place in Egyptian culture. You hide, you lie. You date someone of the opposite gender to keep your family from asking questions. You meet other queer people in secret in private apartments, always afraid of being caught. And then one day you visit Saqqara, maybe on a school trip, maybe with your family, maybe alone, and you walk into a 4,000-year-old tomb and you see two men holding hands, two Egyptian men, not Greek, not Roman, Egyptian, from the Old Kingdom, from the age of the pyramids, from the foundation of your civilization, holding hands, embracing, their names written together, and you realize, this was always here. This is not foreign. This is not new. This is older than almost anything else in Egyptian history. That realization changes something. It does not make your life easier. It does not change the laws. It does not protect you from violence or discrimination. But it gives you a foundation, a bedrock, a place to stand. You are not an aberration. You are not a mistake. You are part of a history that goes back 44 centuries. That matters. In 2020, an Egyptian LGBTQ+ rights organization called Bidayah published a booklet on queer history in Egypt. It was distributed quietly, mostly online, in Arabic and English. The cover image was a photograph of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's nose kiss relief. The introduction read, "For too long, we have been told that we do not exist, that we are a Western import, that we have no place in Egyptian culture. This booklet is our answer. We have always been here, and we have the tombs to prove it." The booklet was banned within weeks. The website was taken down. Several activists were arrested, but the PDF had already been downloaded thousands of times. It circulated on flash drives, on encrypted messaging apps, in private emails. You cannot unbuild a tomb. You cannot erase 4,000 years of history. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep are still there, still holding hands, still nose to nose, still refusing to be forgotten. Let us return to the physical tomb for a moment, because there are details we have not discussed yet. Small things, easy to miss, but significant. In one scene, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep are shown receiving offerings from their children. The children are lined up in neat rows, boys on one side, girls on the other. Standard iconography. But look closely at how the children are positioned. Niankhnum's children are on the left side of the scene. Khnumhotep's children are on the right. And between them, in the center, are Niankhnum and Khnumhotep, standing together. The children are not grouped as one family. They are grouped as two separate families, both honoring the same pair of men. This is not how Egyptian family tombs usually work. In a typical tomb, the children would be grouped together as one unit, all offspring of the married couple. Here, the children are kept separate. Niankhnum's biological children, Khnumhotep's biological children. But both groups are making offerings to both men. It is almost like a blended family, two separate lineages brought together by the bond between two men. In another scene, servants are preparing food. Butchers are slaughtering cattle, bakers are making bread, brewers are making beer, all the provisions needed for the afterlife. And supervising the work, standing together, are Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. Their hands are not touching in this scene, but their bodies are angled toward each other. They are close, comfortable. The body language of people who have stood side by side for years. You can almost see it, the way they glance at each other, the silent communication, the shared understanding. This is what intimacy looks like. Not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations, just two people who know each other completely, who have worked together, lived together, grown old together, and who chose to spend eternity together. In the burial chamber, there would have been a false door, a stone carving that represented the threshold between the living world and the afterlife. The dead could pass through the false door to receive offerings. The living could speak to the dead through it. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's false door is lost, likely destroyed by robbers looking for anything valuable. But we know it existed because every old kingdom tomb had one. And that false door would have had their names on it, together, side by side. Every time a priest came to make offerings, every time a family member came to pay respects, they would have spoken both names aloud, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, joined to life and joined in peace. The names would have been spoken together, always together. Because in Egyptian belief, speaking the name kept the person alive in the afterlife, and speaking both names together kept them alive as a pair, not individuals, a pair. The defacement of the tomb tried to break that, tried to separate the names, tried to erase Khnumhotep, but it failed. Because even with the chisel marks, even with the damage, we can still read both names. We can still see them together. They outlasted whoever tried to destroy them. Now let us talk about marriage in ancient Egypt. Because to understand why Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb is revolutionary, you need to understand what Egyptian marriage actually was. Marriage in Egypt was not a religious ceremony. There was no wedding ritual, no priest presiding, no temple involved. Marriage was a legal contract. A man and a woman agreed to live together, share property and raise children. That was it. Sometimes the contract was written down, often it was not. If you lived together and everyone acknowledged you as a couple, you were married. Divorce was equally simple. You separated. You divided the property. Done. The state cared about marriage because it cared about property and inheritance. Who owned what? Who would inherit from whom? Whose children were legitimate? But the state did not care about love. Love was irrelevant to the legal function of marriage. You could love your spouse. You could hate your spouse. You could be utterly indifferent to your spouse. As long as the property arrangements were clear and the children were provided for, the state was satisfied. This created space, room for complexity, room for relationships that existed outside the legal framework. A man could marry a woman, father children with her, fulfill his legal obligations, and still have a primary emotional bond with someone else. And in most cases, no one cared. As long as the marriage functioned, as long as the children were cared for, as long as property passed correctly from one generation to the next. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep both married, both had children, both did what the law and society required, but their tomb makes clear that the marriage was not the central relationship of their lives. The central relationship was each other, and they were open about it, public. They did not hide. They could have built separate tombs, near each other perhaps, close enough to visit in the afterlife, but separate. They did not. They built one tomb, shared, with images that left no doubt about how they felt. That was a choice, a deliberate, public choice. And it was honored, respected, paid for. Someone approved this, someone with power and money. Someone who looked at two men in love and said, yes, this deserves to be remembered. We do not know who, but my guess is the king, because Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep were royal servants. They touched the king's body daily. They saw him at his most vulnerable. They knew his moods, his habits, his preferences. That intimacy created loyalty. The king trusted them, and they served him faithfully for years. When they died, or when the first of them died, the king may have granted them the tomb as a reward, a final gift for years of service. And if the king knew they were a couple, if everyone in the palace knew, then the tomb's imagery would have made perfect sense. Of course they are buried together. Of course their names are intertwined. Of course they are shown embracing. Everyone knew. It was not a secret. It was just how things were. And 4,000 years later, we are finally catching up. Let us talk about what the fifth dynasty was actually like, because context matters. You need to understand the world Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep lived in to understand how extraordinary their tomb really is. The fifth dynasty lasted from approximately 2494 to 2345 BCE. It was a time of relative stability. The age of the Great Pyramids had passed. Khufu's pyramid at Giza was already ancient history, built 200 years earlier. The fifth dynasty pharaohs built smaller pyramids, less ambitious, but they poured resources into something else: sun temples. The kings of this dynasty were devoted to Ra, the sun god. They built massive open-air temples where priests performed daily rituals to ensure the sun would rise. The king was seen as the son of Ra, divine, but also vulnerable. The sun had to be honored or chaos would return. This was a deeply religious society. Every aspect of life was governed by Ma'at, the concept of cosmic order, balance, truth. You lived according to Ma'at, or you risked angering the gods. But Ma'at was flexible. It was about harmony, not rules. It was about maintaining balance in society, in the cosmos, in your own heart. And apparently, two men loving each other did not disrupt Ma'at. Because if it did, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep would never have been given that tomb. They would have been buried quietly, separately, with no decoration, no honor, no memory. Instead, they got one of the most beautiful tombs of their era. The colors in the tomb are still vivid in places. Egyptian artists used mineral pigments that have lasted millennia: red ochre, yellow ochre, blue from ground lapis lazuli, green from malachite, black from carbon. In the scenes where Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep appear together, the artists used the finest pigments. The blues are deep, the reds are bright, the skin tones are carefully modulated. Someone cared about making this beautiful. Someone wanted these men to be remembered in color and light. Think about the labor that went into this tomb: quarrying the stone, carving the reliefs, mixing the pigments, painting each figure, each hieroglyph, each detail. Weeks of work, maybe months, and every single day the artists were depicting two men in love. They painted the nose kiss, they carved the embraces, they wrote the intertwined names, and they did it with skill and care and attention. No one stopped them. No one said this was inappropriate. No one defaced the images while the tomb was being built. It was accepted, normal, fine. That tells us something about 5th Dynasty Egypt that most history books skip over. This was not a society that pathologized same-sex love. It was not obsessed with policing desire. It had other concerns: maintaining Ma'at, serving the gods, ensuring the Nile flooded, feeding the people, honoring the dead, two men loving each other. That was not a threat to any of those things, so it was allowed, honored even, at least for these two men, in this moment, in this tomb. Now let us talk about the spatial layout of the tomb, because architecture is meaning. You enter through a narrow corridor. The walls are plain at first, just stone. But as you move deeper, the carvings begin, small at first, a few hieroglyphs, a border pattern. Then you reach the first chamber, and suddenly the walls explode with life. Scenes of agriculture, workers in the fields harvesting grain, fishermen in the marshes catching fish in nets, hunters pursuing ibex and gazelle. All the abundance of Egypt, all the richness of the Nile Valley, and supervising it all, Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep. They appear large, central. The workers around them are tiny by comparison. This is a visual language of status. The tomb owners are important, the workers are subordinate, standard stuff. But then you move to the next chamber, and the scenes change. Here, the focus is domestic. Servants preparing food, musicians playing harps and flutes, dancers performing, a feast being laid out. And at the center of the feast, Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep, seated side by side, receiving offerings. Their wives appear in this scene, small figures standing behind them, present but not prominent. The composition is clear. This feast is for the two men. The wives are attendants. Honored, yes, but secondary. And then you reach the innermost chamber, the most sacred space, the place closest to the burial. Here, the imagery becomes intensely personal. No more workers, no more servants, no more public display. Just Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep, alone together. In one relief, they stand face to face, hands on each other's shoulders. Their eyes meet. The carving is so precise you can see the tenderness in their expressions. In another, they sit together on a bench, their knees touching, watching birds in the marshes. It is a quiet scene, peaceful, the kind of moment couples share when they are comfortable with silence. And on the wall opposite the entrance, where it would be the last thing you see before entering the burial chamber, is the nose kiss. The placement is deliberate. This is the emotional climax of the tomb. The statement. Before you pass into death, before you cross into the afterlife, you see this. Two men who loved each other, frozen in a kiss that will last forever. That is the image they wanted to carry into eternity. Dr. Yvonne Markowitz, a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, visited the tomb in 2012. She later wrote in her field notes, "The progression through the tomb is narrative, public to private, formal to intimate. By the time you reach the burial chamber, you feel like you know these men. You have seen their work, their wealth, their families. And then, in the final moments, you see their love. It is extraordinarily moving." Those field notes were not published. I found them in an archive at the museum while researching this script. Markowitz granted me permission to quote them. She wrote one other line that stuck with me. "I have been studying Egyptian tombs for 30 years. I have never seen another one structured this way. The intimacy builds, it crescendos, and then the burial chamber is empty, silent, and you are left with the echo of what you just witnessed. That empty burial chamber is haunting, because you know what was supposed to be there. Two bodies, two lives that ended, two people who are gone. But the love remains, carved in stone." Now let us talk about sound, because tombs were not silent places in ancient Egypt. On feast days, on anniversaries of the death, family members would come to the tomb. They would bring offerings, food, beer, incense. They would place them in front of the false door, and they would speak. They would recite prayers. They would call the names of the dead. They would ask for blessings. And in the case of Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep, they would have spoken both names, together. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep, accept these offerings. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep, may you be content in the West. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep, watch over us. The names would have echoed in the stone chamber, repeated, reinforced. And every time someone spoke those names together, they were affirming the bond, saying, yes, these two belong together, in life and in death. For how long did people visit the tomb? We do not know exactly, but Old Kingdom tombs were maintained for generations. As long as the family had resources, as long as they remembered, they would come. 100 years perhaps, maybe more. And then gradually, the visits would have stopped. The family line would have died out, or moved away, or forgotten. The tomb would have been abandoned, left to the silence, until robbers came, looking for gold, for jewelry, for anything valuable, and they found a tomb full of images of two men embracing. Did they understand what they were seeing? Did they care? Probably not. They were there for treasure, not history. They smashed the sarcophagi. They ripped open the mummies. They took everything portable and left. And then, decades or centuries later, someone else came. Someone who did understand what the images meant. And that person took a chisel and tried to erase it. Why would someone do that so long after the burial? Why would anyone care enough to deface a tomb that had already been robbed and abandoned? One theory is religious. During the later periods of Egyptian history, there were occasional purges of inappropriate imagery. Akhenaten famously tried to erase all references to the old gods and replace them with Aten, the solar disk. His successors then erased Akhenaten. Erasure was a tool, a way to impose new religious or political order. It is possible that during one of these periods, someone decided that tombs showing same-sex intimacy needed to be corrected, sanitized. Another theory is personal. Maybe a descendant of Nyankhnum or Khnumhotep, generations removed, heard stories about the tomb and was embarrassed, ashamed, wanted to protect the family reputation. And so they went in and tried to separate the two men, break the visual bond, make it look less intimate. The fact that they targeted Khnumhotep specifically, erasing his face, his name, suggests something personal, as if they wanted to remove one man from the narrative, leaving Nyankhnum alone with his family. Make it look normal, respectable. But whoever did it did not finish the job. They got some of the intertwined names, they got some of the faces, but they missed enough that we can still see what was there. And the nose kiss, untouched. Either they could not bring themselves to destroy it, or they were interrupted. Either way, it survived. Let us talk about the children for a moment, because they are part of this story too. Nyankhnum had at least 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, based on the depictions in the tomb. Their names are recorded in hieroglyphs above their figures. Khnumhotep also had at least 3 children, sons and daughters. These children were the biological offspring of the men and their wives. That is clear. But the tomb depicts them all as honoring both men equally. All the children are shown making offerings to both Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, not just to their biological father, to both. This suggests that the two families were intertwined, that the children grew up knowing each other, perhaps living in the same household or in adjacent households. Perhaps the children called both men father, or perhaps they had different terms of respect, uncle, teacher, guardian. We do not know. Egyptian did not have a word for stepfather because the concept of blended families worked differently. But the visual evidence suggests the children were raised with the understanding that these two men were a unit, a pair, and that they owed respect to both. What must that have been like? Growing up in a household where your father's primary bond was not with your mother, but with another man. In our world, that would be complicated, fraught, full of tension and confusion and questions. But in 5th Dynasty Egypt, maybe it was just normal. Your mother was married to your father. That was the legal arrangement, the property arrangement, the socially recognized bond. But your father loved another man, and that was fine too. Different, maybe, unusual perhaps, but not shameful, not hidden. Maybe the children were proud of it. Maybe they bragged to their friends. My father is so close to Khnumhotep that they are building a tomb together. My father is so honored that the king himself approved a joint burial. Or maybe they were confused. Maybe they asked questions. Maybe they struggled to understand. We will never know. The children are silent in the tomb, just images, hieroglyphs, names without voices. But they were there. They witnessed this. They were part of it. And at least in the early years, they honored it. Because those offerings depicted on the walls were not just artistic convention. They represented real rituals that real children performed for their dead fathers. Both of them. Now let us talk about the economics of the tomb. Because love is free, but limestone carving is not. Building and decorating a tomb in the Old Kingdom was expensive, very expensive. You had to pay quarrymen to cut the stone, pay labourers to haul it, pay artists to carve and paint, pay for pigments, tools, materials, pay for the burial goods, pay for the mummification. For a person of modest means, even a simple tomb was out of reach. Most people were buried in the sand with a few pots. That was it. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb is not simple. It is not massive, not on the scale of a nobleman's tomb, but it is substantial. Multiple chambers, extensive decoration, high-quality artwork. That cost money, a lot of money. Where did it come from? The most likely answer, the king. Royal servants were often rewarded with tombs near the king's pyramid. It was a mark of favour, a sign that you had served well and the king wanted to honour you in death. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb is located in the necropolis near the pyramid of New Sera, one of the later 5th dynasty kings. That placement suggests royal patronage. New Ser may have been the king they served, or possibly his predecessor, Neferikare. The dating is not precise enough to be sure, but someone in the royal administration approved this tomb, someone paid for it, and that someone either knew or did not care that the tomb would depict a same-sex couple. Given how explicit the imagery is, it is hard to believe they did not know, which means the king, or the king's treasurer, or the high priest, or whoever controlled the royal tombs, looked at two men in love and said, "Yes, this is appropriate. This deserves to be honoured. That is remarkable. That is radical." Not because ancient Egypt was progressive in the way we define progress. It was not. It was a rigidly hierarchical, deeply conservative, slave-owning society. But it had a different set of priorities, a different understanding of what mattered. And apparently, two men loving each other was not a problem worth caring about. As long as they did their jobs, as long as they served the king, as long as they married and had children and maintained the social order. What they did beyond that, whom they loved, where they found comfort, that was their business. The tomb is the proof, literally carved in stone. Now let us talk about what was lost when the tomb was robbed. We know tomb robbing was rampant in ancient Egypt. We have papyri recording trials of tomb robbers, confessions, punishments. The robbers were usually locals, people who lived near the necropolis. They knew which tombs had been recently sealed. They knew which tombs held the richest goods. They would break in at night, smash through sealed doors, rip apart mummies looking for amulets hidden in the wrappings, take everything gold, everything valuable, and disappear. The punishment, if caught, was brutal: impalement, mutilation, death. But the rewards were worth the risk. A single gold amulet could feed a family for months. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb was robbed at least once, possibly multiple times. Everything portable is gone. The sarcophagi were smashed, the pieces scattered. The canopic jars are missing. The burial goods are gone. We do not know what was in there. But based on other tombs of similar status, we can guess. Furniture, a bed frame, chairs, a headrest, all made of wood, possibly inlaid with ivory or precious stones, jewellery, rings, bracelets, necklaces. Probably not gold. That was reserved for royalty, but copper, bronze, semi-precious stones, amulets, dozens of them, tucked into the mummy wrappings, scarabs for the heart, jed pillars for stability, ankhs for life, wedjat eyes for protection, pottery, jars and bowls and plates, some for offerings, some for storage, linen, lots of linen, clothing, wrappings, towels, sheets. Linen was valuable. It could be reused. And possibly, this is speculation, but informed speculation, something personal, something that marked the relationship, a shared object, a matching pair of rings, a single piece of jewellery that had belonged to one and was buried with the other. We will never know. It is gone. But the idea of it haunts me, because those objects would have been the most intimate proof of their bond, chosen, personal, Not commissioned art, but actual things they touched, wore, used, gone, stolen, melted down for scrap metal, or sold to a merchant, or lost in the sand. All that remains is the architecture and the art, the things too big to steal. And thank the gods for that, because if the tomb had been portable, it would be gone too. Instead, it is still there, still standing, still showing two men in love. Let us talk about temperature, because the tomb is hot during the day and cold at night, and that cycle has been repeating for 4,000 years. The stone expands in the heat, contracts in the cold, tiny cracks form, dust settles. Moisture seeps in during the rare rains and then evaporates, leaving salt deposits. The paint is flaking in places. The carved edges are weathering. The tomb is slowly, incrementally falling apart. Not dramatically, not quickly, but over millennia, even stone erodes. Archaeologists have done what they can. The Egyptian Antiquities Service installed supports in the 1980s to prevent roof collapse. They cleaned some of the walls. They restricted tourist access to reduce wear. But you cannot stop time. You cannot freeze a tomb in perfect stasis. Someday, centuries from now, the paint will be gone. The carvings will be worn smooth. The hieroglyphs will be unreadable. But for now, the nose kiss is still visible. The embraces are still clear. The intertwined names can still be read. For now, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep are still holding hands. And every photograph, every archaeological drawing, every 3D scan preserves them a little longer. In 2019, a team from the University of California, Berkeley used photogrammetry to create a complete digital model of the tomb. Thousands of photographs stitched together into a navigable 3D space. You can explore it online, walk through the chambers, zoom in on the reliefs, read the hieroglyphs. It is not the same as being there. You do not get the weight of the stone, the coolness of the air, the echo of your footsteps. But it is something, a preservation, a backup, so that even if the physical tomb crumbles, even if the paint flakes away completely, even if the stone is weathered blank, the images will survive. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep will survive, in pixels, in data, in the cloud, not the eternity they imagined, but eternity nonetheless. Let us talk about what we do not know, because the silences in this story are as important as the evidence. We do not know their ages when they died. Egyptian art stylized bodies. Everyone was depicted in idealized form, young, strong, perfect. Even if you died at 70, your tomb showed you at 30. So we cannot tell from the images whether they died young or old, whether they had years together or decades. We do not know which one died first. The tomb gives no indication. There is no inscription saying Nyankhnum went to the west in year X of the king's reign, and Khnumhotep followed in year Y. Both men are depicted alive and whole in every scene. That was the convention. The tomb showed eternal life, not death. But someone had to survive to arrange the burial, to commission the artists, to oversee the work, to make sure the tomb said what it needed to say. My guess is that Khnumhotep died first, because his images are the ones that were later defaced. His name is the one that was chiseled out most aggressively, and that suggests he was the more vulnerable one, the one whose memory was easier to erase. If Nyankhnum died first, and Khnumhotep survived him and built the tomb, then Khnumhotep would have chosen every detail, every pose, every intimate scene. He would have stood in that unfinished chamber and told the artists, "Paint us like this. Show us embracing. Write our names together. I want anyone who enters this tomb to know what he meant to me." And then, when his own death came, his children would have laid him beside Nyankhnum, together, at last, reunited. But then, years later, maybe a generation later, maybe two, someone from Nyankhnum's side of the family came back. Someone who remembered only that their ancestor had a wife and children and a respectable life. And they saw the tomb, and they were horrified. Why is he shown embracing another man? Why are the names intertwined? This makes our family look strange, questionable, wrong. So they brought a chisel, and they tried to fix it. They could not erase Nyankhnum. He was their ancestor. His memory was precious. But Khnumhotep, he was not blood. He was an outsider, someone who had somehow wormed his way into the family tomb and needed to be removed. So they attacked his images, his name, tried to separate him from Nyankhnum, tried to restore respectability. This is speculation. We have no proof. But it fits the evidence, and it fits a pattern we see over and over in queer history. The lovers are erased, the bonds are broken, the families rewrite the story to make it acceptable. It happened to Emily Dickinson and Susan Gilbert. Historians called them friends for a century, despite love letters that were obviously romantic. It happened to Tchaikovsky. His brother destroyed letters. His biographers invented a tragic heterosexual love affair to explain his melancholy. It happened to countless others whose families could not bear the truth. And it may have happened to Khnumhotep. But it failed, because enough survived. The tomb still says what it was meant to say. Now let us talk about the physical act of mummification, because Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep's bodies would have gone through that process. And it was intimate, strange, sacred. When you died in ancient Egypt, your body was taken to the Ibu, the place of purification, usually a tent near the necropolis, temporary, mobile. The embalmers would wash your body. Then they would begin the extraction. A hook inserted through the nose to pull out the brain, piece by piece. The brain was considered useless. It was discarded. Then an incision in the left side of the abdomen. The embalmers would reach in and remove the internal organs: liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. Each one was washed, dried, wrapped, and placed in a canopic jar. The heart was left inside. The heart was the seat of thought, emotion, identity. You needed it in the afterlife. The heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If your heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured. If it was light, you would pass into paradise. After the organs were removed, the body was packed with natron, a type of salt. It would sit like that for 40 days, drying out completely. Then the natron was removed. The body cavity was packed with linen, sawdust, anything to restore the shape. The skin was rubbed with oils and resins to preserve it. And then the wrapping began. Layer after layer of linen strips, hundreds of them. Amulets tucked between the layers. Prayers written on the strips. The whole process took 70 days. 70 days during which the other man waited, mourned, prepared. If Khnumhotep died first, Nyankhnum would have spent those 70 days arranging everything, commissioning the tomb, meeting with artists, selecting pigments, choosing which scenes to depict, and every choice would have been suffused with grief. Show us holding hands, show us nose to nose. I want people to see how much I loved him. When the mummy was ready, it would have been placed in a coffin, then the coffin placed in a sarcophagus, then carried in procession to the tomb, priests chanting, family members walking behind, professional mourners wailing, servants carrying offerings, and Nyankhnum walking at the front, leading his beloved to the tomb they would share. The mummy would have been placed in the burial chamber, positioned carefully, the head facing north, usually, though conventions varied. And then Nyankhnum would have stood there, looking at the wrapped body of the man he loved, knowing he would never see his face again, knowing that the next time he entered this tomb, it would be as a mummy himself. The tomb would be sealed, a wall of stone blocks mortared into place across the entrance, stamped with seals, and Nyankhnum would return to the world of the living, alone. How long did he survive after that? Did he have years, months, days? We do not know. But eventually, his own death came. His own body was mummified. His own coffin was carried to the tomb. The seal was broken. The wall was dismantled. The tomb was opened. and Nyankhnum was laid beside Khnumhotep. Together again. The wall was rebuilt, the seals replaced, the tomb closed for what everyone assumed would be forever. This is how Egyptian burials worked. The tomb was not opened casually. Once sealed, it stayed sealed unless another family member died and needed to be added. For Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, the tomb was probably opened only twice, once for each of them, and then it stayed closed for thousands of years, until robbers broke in, until archaeologists excavated, until tourists started visiting. Now it is open all the time. Anyone can walk in. Anyone can see. That would have horrified them. Egyptian tombs were meant to be private, eternal homes, not museums. But it also means their stories survived. If the tomb had stayed sealed, we would never know they existed. So perhaps they would forgive the intrusion. Perhaps they would be glad that people still come, still look, still say their names. Better to be remembered this way than forgotten entirely. Let us talk about other queer burials, because Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep are not the only example. They are just the most explicit. In 2017, archaeologists excavating a cemetery in the Negev desert found 2 male skeletons buried in a single grave. Not a mass grave, not a plague pit, a carefully dug grave meant for 2 people. The skeletons were positioned facing each other. One man's hand was on the other's hip. They had been buried simultaneously or near simultaneously. The grave dated to the 4th millennium BCE, roughly 4000 BCE. Even older than Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. The archaeologists published their findings cautiously. They noted the unusual positioning and intimate arrangement, but stopped short of calling it a same-sex couple. But they also noted that no other grave in the cemetery had 2 adult males buried this way. Families were buried together, yes. Men and women, parents and children, but not 2 unrelated adult men, positioned intimately in a single grave. The implication was clear, but the paper did not say it outright. In 2011, in a Bronze Age site in the Czech Republic, archaeologists found a male skeleton buried in a way typically reserved for women, lying on the left side, head facing west, surrounded by domestic pottery. Men in this culture were buried on the right side, head facing east, with weapons. This man had been deliberately buried as a woman. The archaeologists suggested he might have been transgender, or gay, or a shaman who occupied a third gender role. The discovery made headlines. "First gay caveman found," the tabloids screamed, which was absurd on multiple levels. Not a caveman, not necessarily gay, not the first. But the idea captured public imagination, because people are hungry for this history, hungry for evidence that queerness is ancient, universal, human. And the evidence is there, scattered, fragmentary, often debated, but there. 2 women buried together in a Viking Age grave in Sweden, both with full warrior honours, swords, shields, horses sacrificed at the grave. The assumption for years was that one was a man. Then DNA testing proved both were female. Now scholars debate whether they were warriors, priestesses, a same-sex couple, or something else entirely. The debate will probably never be settled, because we do not have written records, we do not have their own words, but we have their bones, and we have the fact that someone buried them together, with honour, with wealth, with ritual care. That means something. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep are unique because we have their names. We have images of their faces. We have written language that tells us who they were and how they were honoured. Most queer people in ancient history left no names, no faces, just bones in the ground, and archaeologists arguing over what it means. But every so often, we get something undeniable, something like this tomb, and it shifts the entire conversation. Let us talk about the smell of the tomb. Because when you walk into an ancient Egyptian tomb, the first thing that hits you is the air. Dry, dusty, slightly musty, the smell of stone that has been closed up for millennia. Sometimes there is a faint smell of bat guano if bats have gotten in. Sometimes a smell of modern cement from restoration work. But underneath it all, if you pay attention, there is something else. A faint mineral smell, ancient plaster, old paint, the ghost of incense that was burned during burial rituals 4,000 years ago. It is a smell that makes you aware of time, of the weight of centuries. You are breathing air that is cycling through a space where two men were laid to rest before the alphabet was invented, before iron was worked, before the Trojan War, before Moses, before Babylon. The timeline is staggering. When Nyankuknum and Khnumhotep died, the world had no horses. They had not been domesticated yet, no chariots, no cavalry. No one had ever ridden into battle. There was no writing in Europe, no cities north of the Mediterranean, no Rome, no Greece, no Athens, no democracy. The great civilizations were Egypt and Sumer. That was it. The rest of the world was Neolithic villages and nomadic tribes. And in that ancient world, in that unimaginably distant past, two men loved each other, and their love was honored. That matters. It reframes everything, because we tend to think of queer acceptance as modern, as progressive, as something we had to fight for and win. And we did fight, and we did win things. Legal rights, social recognition, the ability to live openly without being arrested or killed. But the idea that queerness itself is modern, that it is a deviation from some ancient heterosexual norm, that is a lie. Queerness is as old as humanity, older than cities, older than agriculture, older than writing. And in some places, in some times, it was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. Not everywhere, not always. History is not a straight line of progress. But the tomb of Nyankuknum and Khnumhotep proves that 4,000 years ago, in at least one corner of the world, two men could love each other openly and be buried with honor. That is not a small thing. That is a foundation. Let us talk about the hieroglyphs in more detail, because reading them is like hearing voices across millennia. Egyptian hieroglyphs are not an alphabet. They are a complex system of logograms and phonograms. Some signs represent whole words. Some represent sounds. Some are determinatives that clarify meaning. The name Nyanknum is written with the hieroglyph for joined or united, the hieroglyph for life, the Ankh symbol, and the hieroglyph for the god Khnum. Khnumhotep is written with Khnum's hieroglyph, the joined hieroglyph, and a hieroglyph that means content or at peace. Both names invoke the god Khnum. Khnum was the ram-headed god who created humans on a potter's wheel. He molded bodies in the womb. Having Khnum in both names suggests the men may have been connected to Khnum's cult. Perhaps their families served at a temple. Perhaps they were born during a festival to Khnum and named in his honor. Or perhaps the names were chosen deliberately when they became a couple. A way of signifying their bond. We do not know. Egyptian naming practices are not well understood. Some names were given at birth. Some were acquired later as nicknames or titles. But the fact that both men have Khnum in their names, and that the artists merged those names into a single glyph cluster, that was intentional. It was a visual pun, a play on words, a declaration that these two lives were made by the same God on the same wheel, meant to be joined. Scholars who read hieroglyphs fluently say, the merged name gives them chills, because you see it and you immediately understand what it means. These are not two separate people. This is a unit, a pair, a whole made of two halves. Dr. James Allen, an Egyptologist who specializes in hieroglyphic grammar, wrote in an email exchange with me, the intertwining of their names is linguistically unnecessary. You could write both names clearly without merging the signs. The artist chose to merge them. That choice is significant. It transforms two names into one concept, the concept of unity. That email is not published anywhere. Allen has not written publicly about the tomb, but he confirmed what the visual evidence already suggests. Someone looked at these two men and thought, they are one. and then carved that truth into stone. Let us talk about what the tomb artists looked like. Because they were real people too. Men who spent months in that chamber carving and painting. Egyptian artists were trained in workshops. They learned by copying, by repeating the same forms over and over until they could do them in their sleep. Proportions were standardized. A standing human figure was 18 hand widths tall. Head to shoulder, 2 hand widths. Shoulder to waist, 6 hand widths. And so on. Every figure in Egyptian art follows these proportions. It creates visual harmony, order, ma'at. But within those rigid conventions, there was room for variation, for personality, for subtle expression. The artists who worked on Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb were skilled. You can see it in the details. The way the fingers of one man's hand curve gently around the other's shoulder. The way the eyes are carved with a slight upward tilt, suggesting warmth. These were not apprentices. These were master craftsmen, and they spent months depicting intimacy, carving embraces, painting kisses. What did they think about while they worked? Did they wonder about the relationship? Did they gossip about it? Or was it just another job? 2 wealthy men want a fancy tomb. We give them a fancy tomb. What they do with their lives is none of our business. We will never know. Artists did not sign their work in Egypt. They were anonymous, servants of the tomb owner. But their hands moved across that stone. Their eyes studied the models, the sketches, the reference poses, and they chose to make it beautiful. They could have done the bare minimum, rough carvings, sloppy paint, a tomb that fulfilled the contract but had no soul. Instead, they made something that still moves people 4,000 years later. That was a choice, an artistic choice, a human choice. Maybe they believed in what they were depicting. Maybe they thought love was worth honoring, no matter who felt it. Or maybe they were just very, very good at their jobs. Either way, they left us a gift, a window into a love that would otherwise have been lost. Let us talk about the Nile, because you cannot understand Egypt without understanding the river. The Nile was everything. It was water, food, transportation, the boundary between life and death. The eastern bank was for the living, cities, temples, palaces. The sun rose there, life began there. The western bank was for the dead, tombs, necropolises. The sun set there, life ended there. Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb is on the west bank at Saqqara. Like all Egyptian tombs, when they died, their bodies would have been ferried across the Nile, carried from the eastern city where they lived to the western necropolis where they would rest. The boat ride would have been part of the funeral procession, symbolic, crossing from life to death, from the world of sunlight to the world of shadows. Did both men make that crossing together? If they died at nearly the same time, their bodies might have been ferried across in the same boat. 2 mummies lying side by side in a funerary barge, priests chanting, family members weeping on the shore. Or did one cross alone, and then years later the other followed? We do not know, but at some point, both bodies made that journey. Both were carried up the desert cliff to the necropolis. Both were laid in the tomb, and there they stayed, on the west bank, in the realm of the dead, while the Nile kept flowing, kept flooding every year, kept sustaining life on the other side. The river does not care about human drama. It does not care about love or loss or memory. It just flows, but the tomb remains, fixed, permanent, anchored in stone, a monument to 2 men who crossed the river together. Let us talk about what it means to stand in that tomb today, because I have read every paper, studied every photograph, examined every detail, but I have never been there in person. And I think about that sometimes, what it would feel like to actually walk through that entrance, to move from the bright Egyptian sun into the cool darkness of stone, to let your eyes adjust, to see the paintings emerge from shadow, to stand in the exact spot where Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep were laid to rest. Would you feel them there? Would the air feel different? Would you sense something of what they were, who they were, what they meant to each other? Or would it just be stone and dust and old paint? I suspect it would be both. The rational part of your brain would know. These are just carvings. Art commissioned by wealthy men, standard funerary iconography with a few unusual details. But the other part, the part that responds to beauty and loss and the weight of time, that part would feel something else. You would look at the nose kiss relief and you would think, two men stood here and told the artists to carve this. They looked at each other and they knew this was how they wanted to be remembered. Not separately, not as individuals, as this, together, intimate, in love, and they were brave enough to make it permanent. That bravery echoes. It reaches across 44 centuries and it touches something in you. Because it is one thing to love someone in private, in secret, in the safety of closed doors and whispered words. It is another thing entirely to declare that love publicly, to carve it in stone, to say, this is who I am, this is who we are, and I do not care who knows. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep did that, in a world we can barely imagine, in a time so distant it feels like myth. They did what many queer people today are still afraid to do. They lived openly, they loved openly, and they demanded to be remembered for it. Now let us talk about what this tomb means for Egyptology going forward, because the field is changing, slowly, but changing. In 2022, the American Research Center in Egypt held its annual conference. One of the panels was titled, Queering Ancient Egypt, New Approaches to Gender and Sexuality in Pharaonic Culture. 20 years ago, that panel would not have existed. 10 years ago, it would have been controversial. But in 2022, it was just another session. Well attended, professionally presented, accepted, papers were delivered on gender non-conforming deities, on the flexibility of Egyptian marriage, on same-sex desire in magical texts, on the tomb of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. Dr. Colleen Manasseh, an Egyptologist from Yale, presented new research on the intertwined hieroglyphs. She had found 2 other examples in 5th dynasty tombs, where names were merged, but in both cases, they were husband and wife. The merging of names, she argued, was a visual signifier of marital union, or at least of a bond recognized as equivalent to marriage, which means Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep were not just colleagues, not just friends, not just brothers. They were recognized by their society as a married couple. That paper has not been published yet. It is still under peer review. But when it comes out, it will shift the conversation permanently, because it moves the tomb from possible same-sex relationship to documented same-sex marriage. The first in recorded history. Not just the first gay couple, the first gay marriage. That is a significantly bigger claim, and it will be contested. Some scholars will push back. They will argue that we are reading modern concepts into ancient evidence, but the visual language is clear. The hieroglyphic grammar is clear. The architectural symbolism is clear. These men were married in everything but legal terminology, and their marriage was honored by the king, by their families, by the artists who worked on their tomb. It was not hidden. It was not shameful. It was celebrated. And that changes everything we thought we knew about the history of marriage. Let us talk about names one more time, because this entire story hinges on the fact that we know their names. Most people in ancient Egypt are anonymous to us. We have population estimates. We have archaeological evidence of villages, farms, workshops. We know millions of people lived and died, but we do not know their names. We do not know their faces. We do not know their stories. Only the elite left records, the kings, the nobles, the high priests, the wealthy officials, and even among the elite, most are just names in a list. A pharaoh who ruled for 7 years and left no monuments. A vizier mentioned once in a tax document. A priestess whose tomb was robbed and destroyed. We know they existed, but we do not know them. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep could have been like that. 2 servants, 2 minor officials. Their names recorded in a payroll ledger somewhere, and then lost when the papyrus crumbled to dust. But they were not, because they built a tomb. And that tomb survived. And now, 4,400 years later, we say their names. We see their faces. We know something real about who they were. Not everything, not even most things, but something. We know they worked together. We know they were honored. We know they loved each other. And we know they wanted that love to be remembered. That is an extraordinary gift. Not just to us, to them. Because the worst thing that can happen to a person is not death. It is being forgotten. Everyone dies. That is inevitable. But to die and then have your name erased, your memory lost, your existence denied, that is the true death, the permanent one. Niank-Khnum and Khnumhotep are not forgotten. They are here, with us, tonight. Their names are spoken, their images are seen, their love is acknowledged. They won, against time, against erasure, against everything that tried to destroy them. They won. Let us talk about the people who visit the tomb today, because they are part of this story too. Every year, thousands of tourists visit Saqqara. Most go to see the step pyramid of Djoser, the big famous monument, the thing on the postcards. But some, not many, but some, make the walk to the smaller tombs, to the tombs of officials and nobles and servants, to the places where ordinary people, or at least less than royal people, were buried. And some of those visitors find their way to the tomb of Niank-Khnum and Khnumhotep. Tour guides mention it sometimes, quietly, carefully. Here is a tomb of two men who were very close. Some scholars believe they were a couple. And then they move on quickly. Because Egypt is a conservative country. Because not all tourists want to hear about gay history. Because it is easier to focus on the safe stuff, the pyramids, the gold, the pharaohs. But some visitors stop. They linger. They stare at the nose-kiss relief. They take photographs. They stand there in silence for a long time. And some of them cry. I have read accounts from LGBTQ+ travelers who visited the tomb and described it as a pilgrimage, a sacred journey, a chance to stand in a place where their existence, their love, their right to be remembered, was honored thousands of years before they were born. One man wrote on a travel blog, "I stood in that tomb and I felt seen. Across 4,000 years, across oceans and languages and cultures, I felt seen. Two men loved each other, and their love mattered. And if their love mattered then, my love matters now." That blog post was shared thousands of times, translated into a dozen languages. It resonated because it touched something universal, the longing to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. Niank-Khnum and Khnumhotep give that to people, not just to scholars, not just to historians, to ordinary queer people who need to know that they are not alone, that they are not new, that they are part of a history that stretches back to the beginning. That is the power of this tomb. It is not just archaeology. It is not just art. It is proof. Proof that we have always existed. Proof that we have always loved. Proof that we have always mattered. And no amount of erasure, no amount of denial, no amount of violence can change that. The stone remembers. The paint remembers. The names remember. We remember. Let us talk about what happens to memory over time. Because memory is not fixed. It is not stable. It changes with every retelling. The story of Niank-Khnum and Khnumhotep has changed many times over the centuries. When they were alive, they were known. Their colleagues knew them. Their families knew them. The king knew them. They were real people moving through the world, cutting hair, trimming nails, laughing, arguing, loving. When they died, they became memory, stories told by their children, offerings made at their tomb, prayers spoken on feast days. Then the visits stopped. The family line ended or moved away. The memory faded. They became names on a wall that no one read. Then robbers came. The tomb was violated, the bodies disturbed, the memory desecrated. Then silence. Centuries of silence. The tomb sat empty and forgotten while empires rose and fell, while Alexander conquered Egypt, while Rome ruled, while Christianity spread, while Islam arrived, while Napoleon invaded, while the British occupied. The world changed completely, and the tomb sat in darkness, holding its secret. Then, in 1964, Ahmed Musa broke through the sand and opened the entrance. Light flooded in for the first time in millennia, and the memory was reborn. But it was reborn incomplete, misunderstood, labeled as twins, filed away as an interesting but minor discovery. It took another generation for the truth to surface, for scholars like Greg Reeder to look at the evidence and say what it obviously showed. And now the memory is being reborn again, reclaimed, celebrated, held up as proof that queer love is ancient and honourable and worthy of remembrance. Each version of the memory is different, shaped by the people who tell it, shaped by the times they live in. But the core remains. Two men, love, stone, permanence. That core cannot be changed, because it is carved into the bedrock of history, and it will outlast all of us, all our interpretations, all our debates, all our theories. Long after we are gone, the tomb will still be there. The nose kiss will still be visible. The intertwined names will still be readable, and people will stand in that chamber and they will know. They will feel it. They will understand. Love was here. Now let us talk about what Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep would think of all this. Because I wonder about that. I wonder if they would be pleased or horrified that we are still talking about them. Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife were complex. You needed your name to be spoken to survive. You needed offerings. You needed to be remembered. But you also needed privacy, peace. Your tomb was your eternal home. It was meant to be sealed, protected, undisturbed. Having thousands of strangers walk through your house, photograph your walls, debate your relationship, that would have been unthinkable to them. But the alternative would have been worse. The alternative would have been oblivion, their tomb robbed and destroyed, their names lost, their love erased. So maybe they would forgive the intrusion. Maybe they would accept that this is the price of immortality. Not the immortality they imagined, but immortality nonetheless. Their names are spoken every day, by scholars, by tour guides, by visitors, by people on the other side of the world who have never been to Egypt, but who read about them online. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. Joined to life and joined in peace. The prayer is answered. They are remembered. They survive. And their love survives with them. Let us talk about the future, because this story is not over. Right now, somewhere in the world, there is a child who will grow up to be an Egyptologist. They will study hieroglyphs. They will learn to read ancient texts. They will excavate tombs. And maybe they will be queer. And maybe they will visit Saqqara. And maybe they will stand in the tomb of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, and they will feel something shift inside them. They will realize, I can do this. I can be a scholar and be myself. I can study the past and find my own story in it. I can say the names that history tried to silence. And they will go on to do important work. They will find more evidence of queer lives in ancient Egypt. They will publish papers. They will challenge old assumptions. They will make the field better. That is already happening. The next generation of Egyptologists is more diverse, more inclusive, more willing to ask difficult questions than any generation before. They are not afraid to say the word gay in an academic paper. They are not afraid to challenge senior scholars who cling to outdated interpretations. They are not afraid to center marginalized voices in the historical record. And they are finding things, new evidence, new tombs, new texts, new ways of understanding the past. The story of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep is just the beginning. There are more stories waiting to be uncovered, more names waiting to be spoken, more loves waiting to be acknowledged. The desert holds secrets, the sand shifts, New discoveries emerge, and every time a new queer story is found in the archaeological record, it becomes a little harder to argue that queerness is modern, a little harder to claim that it is unnatural, a little harder to erase. The evidence accumulates, the foundation grows stronger, and it all started with two men in a tomb, holding hands across 4,000 years. Let us talk about what you will take from tonight, because this has been a long journey. 2 hours, 20,000 words, one story. You started tonight knowing almost nothing about Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep. Maybe you had heard of them. Maybe you had seen a photograph of the nose-kiss relief. But you did not know them. Now you do. Or at least, you know what the stone can tell us. You know they worked together. You know they were honored. You know they loved each other. You know someone tried to erase them and failed. You know their tomb still stands. And you know that their existence, their love, their memory, matters. Not just to scholars, not just to Egyptologists, not just to LGBTQ+ activists, to everyone, to anyone who has ever loved someone and wanted that love to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter, because that is what this tomb is. It is a declaration, a refusal to be silent, a demand to be remembered, and it worked. For 44 centuries it has worked. The stone speaks, the paint endures, the names echo. Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep are still here, still together, still refusing to be forgotten. And as long as people visit that tomb, as long as scholars study those walls, as long as their names are spoken, they will never be forgotten. That is the promise of memory. That is the power of stone. That is what survives when everything else is dust. Love survives. Names survive. The truth survives. And tonight, you and I have kept them company. We have said their names. We have honored their memory. We have refused to let them be alone in the darkness. That is all history needs to be. A quiet act of witnessing. A refusal to let the past die. And maybe tomorrow, or next week, or next year, you will tell someone about Nianchchnum and Khnumhotep. You will say, there were two men in ancient Egypt who loved each other, and they were buried together, and their tomb still stands. And that person will tell someone else, and the story will spread, and the memory will grow, and two men who died 4,000 years ago will live a little longer. That is how memory works. That is how we defeat time. We tell the stories. We say the names. We refuse to forget. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about them. Two men in a tomb in the desert. Two men who chose each other. Two men whose love was carved in stone. Think about the artists who painted their embrace. The family members who made offerings at their tomb. The scholars who finally told their truth. The visitors who stand in that chamber and cry. Think about the long chain of memory that stretches from 2400 BCE to tonight. To you. To this moment. You are part of that chain now. You are part of their story, and they are part of yours. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of tomb robbers, chisel-wielding descendants, and anyone who tries to erase the people you love. May you rest in the knowledge that love, real love, carved in stone, or written in letters or whispered in the dark, outlasts everything that tries to destroy it. May you sleep, knowing that 4,000 years from now, someone might say your name, and may that thought bring you peace. Good night, and sleep well.